year was 1492, and in the flickering candlelight of Queen Isabella's court in Castile, a man with weathered hands traced impossible routes across a hand-drawn map. Christopher Columbus, his eyes burning with the fever of discovery, stood before the Spanish monarchs with a proposal that would change the world forever. "Your Majesties," Columbus began, his voice trembling with conviction, "I can reach the Indies by sailing west. The earth is smaller than scholars believe, and the riches of Cathay and Chipangu await us across the ocean sea." The courtiers whispered among themselves, some calling him mad, others intrigued by his audacious vision. For 7 long years, Columbus had wandered the courts of Europe, seeking patronage for his dream of westward passage to Asia. Portugal had rejected him, England had turned him away, France had shown no interest. But here, in the aftermath of the Reconquista, with Granada finally fallen to Christian forces, the Spanish crown was ready to gamble on glory. Ferdinand and Isabella exchanged glances that spoke of destiny. The royal coffers, recently emptied by war, needed replenishment. The promise of gold, spices, and souls for conversion to Christianity proved irresistible. The capitulations of Santa Fe were signed on April 17, 1492, granting Columbus the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea and 10% of all riches discovered. The age of exploration had been brewing for decades. Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal had sent expeditions down the African coast, seeking a sea route to India. Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. The world was opening, and European nations raced to claim their share of untold wealth. Columbus's obsession stemmed from more than mere ambition. He had studied ancient texts, corresponded with learned men, and calculated distances using the works of Ptolemy and Marco Polo. His miscalculations about the Earth's size would prove fortunate, for had he known the true distance to Asia, he might never have attempted the journey. The preparations began immediately. 3 ships were commissioned: the Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship; the Pinta, captained by Martin Alonso Pinzon; and the Nina, under Vicentianus Pinzon. The vessels were modest, the largest being only 85 feet long, but they were sturdy enough for the unknown waters ahead. Recruiting crew proved challenging. Sailors feared the ocean sea, believing it to be filled with monsters and deadly currents. Many thought they would sail off the edge of the world. Columbus finally assembled 90 men, including criminals pardoned on condition of service, experienced mariners seeking fortune, and young men hungry for adventure. As summer faded into autumn, the small fleet made final preparations in Palos de la Frontera. Supplies were loaded: hardtack, salted meat, wine, and water for the journey. Navigational instruments were checked and rechecked. The ship's hulls were sealed with pitch and tar. On August 3, 1492, before dawn broke over the Spanish coast, Columbus knelt in prayer at the Church of St. George. The weight of his dream, the hopes of his patrons, and the fears of his crew all rested upon his shoulders. He had convinced the world's most powerful monarchs to bet their treasury on his vision. Now, with the first light of day illuminating the harbor, it was time to discover whether Christopher Columbus was a visionary or a fool. The anchor chains rattled as they were hauled aboard, and the age of exploration truly began. The morning mist clung to the harbor of Palos as the 3 ships slipped their moorings and caught the tide. Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, watching the familiar coastline of Spain fade into memory. Behind him lay everything he had ever known. Ahead stretched the vast, unmarked expanse of the ocean sea. The first days brought favorable winds and clear skies. The crew, initially nervous about venturing into unknown waters, began to settle into the rhythm of ocean life. Sailors mended sails, checked rigging, and maintained the watches that would keep them safe during the long journey ahead. Columbus maintained careful records documenting wind patterns, sea conditions, and the flight of birds, according to maritime historians. At the Naval War College, Columbus's meticulous record-keeping during this voyage represents some of the earliest systematic oceanographic observations in recorded history. By August 9th, they had reached the Canary Islands, where they stopped for repairs and final provisions. The Nina's rudder had been damaged, and Columbus suspected sabotage by crew members already regretting their decision to join the expedition. While repairs were made, he studied the wind patterns and ocean currents, noting how the trade winds consistently blew from the northeast. On September 6th, they departed from Gomera, the last Spanish territory they would see. Columbus made the fateful decision to keep the logbooks, one showing the true distance traveled, which he kept secret. and another showing shorter distances to prevent the crew from panicking about how far they were from home. The days blended into weeks as they sailed westward into waters no European had ever seen. The crew grew increasingly restless as familiar landmarks disappeared behind them. Strange phenomena began to appear. The compass needle no longer pointed true north. Seaweed floated in massive patches across their path, and unfamiliar birds circled overhead. Columbus interpreted these signs as evidence they were approaching land. The seaweed, he reasoned, must come from nearby shores. The birds surely indicated islands ahead. He encouraged his men with promises of gold and glory, but privately, he worried about maintaining their loyalty if land didn't appear soon. September 25th brought false hope. When Martin Alonso Pinzon shouted land from the Pinta's deck, the crew celebrated wildly, but as they sailed closer, the supposed coastline dissolved into clouds on the horizon, morale plummeted, and murmurs of mutiny began to spread through the fleet. October brought increasing desperation. They had been at sea for over a month, far longer than any previous voyage into the Atlantic. The crew demanded they turn back, arguing that if land existed to the west, they would have found it by now. Columbus pleaded for 3 more days, promising to turn back if they found nothing. On October 7th, the ships changed course slightly to the southwest, following the flight of birds that seemed to know where they were going. This decision, based on centuries of sailors' wisdom about bird migration patterns, would prove crucial to their success. The signs of land grew stronger, pieces of carved wood floating in the water, small branches with fresh leaves, and most encouraging of all, a small board carved with iron tools. Someone had been here before them. But who? October 11th brought the strongest indications yet. The sea became calmer, and the water itself seemed different. As night fell, Columbus stood on the deck, scanning the horizon with desperate intensity. The future of his expedition, his reputation, and perhaps his life depended on what the next day would bring. At 10 o'clock that night, Columbus thought he saw a light flickering in the distance, like a candle moving up and down. He called to Pedro Gutierrez, a court official, who confirmed the sighting. Was it a torch carried by natives on a beach, a fire in a village, or merely another cruel trick of tired eyes and desperate hope? The fleet pressed on through the darkness, with lookouts posted at every vantage point. The promised reward of 10,000 maravedis for the first person to spot land had every man straining his eyes toward the western horizon. As the night wore on, the very air seemed to whisper of approaching destiny. Dawn was still hours away when Rodrigo de Triana, the lookout aboard the Pinta, spotted something that made his heart race. Through the darkness, a pale line appeared on the horizon, different from the endless water they had seen for 33 days. Tira, Tira, he shouted, his voice carrying across the water to the other ships the cry of land, land, electrified. The small fleet. Columbus fell to his knees in prayer, tears streaming down his weathered face. The crew who had threatened mutiny just days before now cheered and embraced each other. They had done the impossible. They had crossed the ocean sea and lived to tell about it. As the sun rose on October 12th, 1492, the island before them revealed itself in stunning detail. Palm trees swayed in the tropical breeze. White sand beaches stretched along the coastline, and clear blue waters lapped gently at the shore. This was nothing like the sophisticated cities of Cathay that Columbus had expected to find. But it was land, and it was beautiful. The natives who emerged from the forests were unlike any people the Europeans had ever seen. They wore no clothes, decorated their bodies with paint, and possessed a natural grace that impressed the newcomers. Columbus, convinced he had reached the Indies, immediately began calling them Indians, a name that would persist for centuries. The admiral of the ocean sea waded ashore, carrying the royal banner of Castile and Leon, with his captains following behind bearing the expedition's flags, in a ceremony that would be repeated countless times across the Americas. Columbus formally claimed the island for the Spanish crown, naming it San Salvador, or Holy Savior. The Taino people who inhabited the island watched this strange ritual with curiosity rather than alarm. They had never seen men with such pale skin or such elaborate clothing. The massive ships floating offshore seemed impossible to their eyes, and the bearded strangers who had emerged from them appeared to be beings from another world. Columbus was fascinated by these people, noting in his diary that they would make excellent servants and could easily be converted to Christianity. He marveled at their generosity, their intelligence, and their apparent lack of weapons. They brought gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and small pieces of gold. which immediately caught the Europeans' attention. Historical records from the Smithsonian Institution confirmed that this first encounter between Columbus and the Taino represents one of the most significant moments in human history, marking the beginning of sustained contact between the Old and New Worlds. The language barrier proved challenging, but through gestures and drawings, Columbus learned that there were other islands nearby, some of which supposedly contained vast amounts of gold. The word Colba kept appearing in the natives' speech, which Columbus interpreted as Colon, his Spanish name, believing they were honoring him. In reality, they were referring to Cuba. For 3 days, the Europeans explored San Salvador, trading trinkets for food and information. Columbus noted everything in his journal: the plants, the animals, the people, and most importantly, any sign of gold or precious stones. He was disappointed to find no evidence of the great cities Marco Polo had described, but he remained convinced that Japan and China lay just beyond the horizon. The Taino proved to be skilled navigators, using sophisticated techniques to travel between islands. They showed Columbus how to read the waves, the winds, and the stars to find their way across the water. These were not the primitive people European prejudices had led him to expect, but a complex society with their own technologies and traditions. As Columbus prepared to continue his exploration, he faced a momentous decision. Should he head west toward the mainland, where the natives indicated great civilizations existed, or should he explore the islands to the south, where they claimed gold was more abundant? The choice he made would determine not only his own fate, but the future of European colonization in the Americas. On October 14th, Columbus ordered his ships to depart San Salvador, taking several Taino as guides and interpreters. He had achieved what many thought impossible, but his greatest discoveries still lay ahead. The admiral of the ocean sea had found a new world. Though he would never fully understand what he had accomplished, the age of European expansion into the Americas had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The small fleet departed San Salvador, with 6 Taino guides aboard, their knowledge of local waters proving invaluable as Columbus navigated the maze of islands that dotted the Caribbean. The Europeans had entered a tropical paradise unlike anything in their experience, where crystal-clear waters revealed coral reefs teeming with colorful fish, and palm-fringed beaches stretched toward dense jungle interiors. Columbus's obsession with finding gold intensified with each island they visited. The Taino spoke repeatedly of Colba, which he believed to be Chipangu, the Japanese islands described by Marco Polo as roofed with gold. Every conversation, every gesture, every trade interaction was filtered through his burning desire to find the riches that would justify his expedition to the Spanish crown. On October 15th, they reached a larger island that Columbus named Santa Maria de la Concepcion. The natives here were similar to those of San Salvador, generous with their gifts and curious about the strange visitors. They brought cotton, parrots, and small ornaments of gold, which Columbus examined with the intensity of a man whose life depended on their value. The Europeans were struck by the apparent absence of warfare among these people. The Taino possessed no swords, no armor, and seemed to have no understanding of the weapons the Spanish carried. When Columbus showed them a blade, they grasped it by the edge and cut themselves, not understanding its purpose. This seeming innocence would prove tragically prophetic. Moving from island to island, Columbus followed the advice of his guides, who promised that greater riches lay ahead. Each new landfall brought hope and disappointment in equal measure. The islands were beautiful, the people welcoming, but the golden cities of his imagination remained elusive. On October 28th, they reached the largest island yet, which Columbus named Juana in honor of Prince John of Castile. The Taino called it Cuba, and they insisted it was so large that it would take many days to sail around it. Columbus convinced himself that this must be the mainland of Cathay, the edge of the great continent of Asia. Maritime archaeology research, published by the University of Florida, suggests that Columbus's route through the Caribbean demonstrates remarkable navigation skills. Considering the complete absence of accurate charts for these waters, the expedition spent weeks exploring Cuba's coast, searching for the great cities that Marco Polo had described. Instead, they found small fishing villages, primitive shelters, and people who seemed to live in harmony with their environment. Columbus sent parties inland to search for gold mines and spice plantations, but they returned with tales of vast forests, strange animals, and native peoples who had never seen Europeans. The most significant discovery came when Columbus's men encountered the Taino practice of smoking dried leaves in pipes, becoming the first Europeans to witness tobacco use. They also observed the natives playing a game with a rubber ball, bouncing it off their bodies in ways that seemed to defy natural law. These small observations would eventually transform European culture, but at the time, Columbus was interested only in gold and spices. Frustration mounted as November progressed. The admiral had promised his crews riches beyond imagination, but so far they had collected only small trinkets and exotic birds. The men began to grumble about the value of their discoveries, and Columbus faced the growing realization that he might return to Spain empty-handed. The breaking point came when Martin Alonso Pinzon, captain of the Pinta, decided to pursue his own course in search of gold. Despite Columbus's orders to stay with the fleet, Pinzon sailed away, taking with him one of the expedition's 3 ships and leaving Columbus with reduced manpower and resources. On December 6th, Columbus reached another large island, which he named Hispaniola, or Little Spain. The natives here seemed more sophisticated than those on previous islands, with larger settlements and more elaborate jewelry. Most encouraging of all, they possessed significantly more gold ornaments, suggesting that the source of the precious metal might finally be within reach. The Taino cacique, or chief, Guacanagari, welcomed the Europeans with great ceremony. He presented Columbus with a mask decorated with gold and precious stones, and spoke of mountains where the yellow metal could be found in abundance. For the first time since leaving San Salvador, Columbus felt that his dreams of wealth might actually be realized. As December progressed, the expedition established increasingly friendly relations with the natives of Hispaniola. Columbus traded European goods for gold ornaments, and his men began to believe that they had finally found the source of riches they had been seeking. The admiral ordered his crew to collect samples of everything they could find, preparing for the eventual return to Spain. But fate had other plans in store for the expedition, and the greatest trial of Columbus's first voyage was yet to come. The waters around Hispaniola appeared deceptively calm. On the night of December 24th, 1492, Columbus had retired to his cabin after days of successful trading with the native Taino, his mind filled with plans for establishing a permanent Spanish presence in these new lands. The Santa Maria drifted peacefully under the stars, her crew celebrating Christmas Eve with wine and stories of the riches they would soon carry home. Juan de la Cosa, the ship's owner and master, had left the vessel in the hands of a young cabin boy while he and most of the crew slept. This violation of basic seamanship would prove catastrophic. The inexperienced youth, unable to feel the subtle changes in the ship's movement, failed to notice that the current was pushing them toward a hidden coral reef. The grinding sound of the ship's hull against coral woke Columbus from his sleep. He rushed to the deck to find the Santa Maria firmly aground, her bottom torn open by the razor-sharp reef. The flagship of his expedition, the vessel that had carried him across the ocean sea to achieve his life stream, was doomed. Desperate efforts to save the ship proved futile. The crew threw cargo overboard to lighten the vessel, but the coral held the Santa Maria fast. With each wave, she settled deeper into the reef, her hull taking on more water. Columbus watched in anguish as his flagship slowly broke apart, taking with her many of the supplies needed for the return voyage to Spain. The disaster might have meant the end of the expedition, but the response of the Taino people demonstrated a generosity that amazed the Europeans. Cacique Guacanagari immediately sent canoes to help rescue the crew and cargo. His people worked tirelessly through the night, saving everything they could from the wreckage without taking so much as a pin for themselves. Columbus was deeply moved by this display of kindness from people his own culture considered primitive. In his journal, he wrote that he could not have received better treatment from his own brothers in Spain. The cacique offered his people's assistance in building a settlement, providing food and shelter, and protecting the Spanish who would remain behind. Archaeological evidence examined by the National Geographic Society suggests that the remains of the Santa Maria may have been located off the coast of Haiti, though the exact location remains disputed among historians. From disaster came opportunity. Columbus realized that the loss of his flagship might actually serve his purposes better than its safe return. With the Santa Maria's timbers, his men could build a fort that would serve as Spain's first permanent foothold in the New World. The settlement would demonstrate Spanish commitment to colonization and provide a base for future expeditions. Construction of La Navidad, named for Christmas Day, began immediately. The fortress was built using timber from the wrecked flagship, with walls high enough to provide defense and quarters comfortable enough for long-term occupation. Columbus selected 39 men to remain behind, including a physician, a carpenter, and several sailors who had shown skill in dealing with the natives. The men chosen to stay at La Navidad were volunteers, motivated by the promise of wealth and the opportunity to explore the island's interior in search of gold mines. Columbus left them with supplies, weapons, and strict instructions to maintain peaceful relations with the Taino, while establishing Spanish authority over the region. As January 1493 arrived, Columbus faced the most difficult decision of his life. The Nina, his only remaining ship, was too small to carry all his men safely back to Spain. He would have to leave nearly half his expedition behind, trusting their survival to the goodwill of people they had known for only a few weeks. The parting was emotional. The men staying behind understood the risks they faced. Isolated in an unknown land thousands of miles from home, those returning to Spain worried about their comrades' fate and wondered if they would ever see them again. Columbus promised to return within a year with more ships and supplies. On January 4, 1493, the Nina set sail from Hispaniola, carrying Columbus and the remainder of his crew towards Spain. The admiral carried with him samples of gold, exotic plants, several Taino natives, and most importantly, the knowledge that he had found lands across the ocean sea. But the voyage home would prove even more challenging than the outbound journey. Columbus had accomplished the impossible by reaching the Indies, but he still had to survive the return trip to share his discoveries with the world. The small, overcrowded Nina faced the fury of the Atlantic winter, and the greatest test of Columbus's seamanship lay ahead. Behind them, the men of La Navidad began their new lives as the first European colonists in the Americas, unaware that they were writing the opening chapter of a story that would transform both the old world and the new. The Nina, now carrying the dreams and fears of Columbus's entire expedition, battled against the Atlantic's winter fury as January 1493 progressed. The small caravel, never intended to bear the full weight of the return journey, struggled under the burden of extra crew members and the precious cargo that would prove to Europe that the expedition had succeeded. Columbus had hoped to encounter the Pinta during his departure from Hispaniola, but Martin Alonso Pinzon and his crew remained mysteriously absent. The admiral faced the terrifying prospect of returning to Spain with only one ship, and no confirmation that his other vessels had survived their separation. The political implications of losing two-thirds of his fleet weighed heavily on his mind. The first weeks of the return voyage proceeded smoothly, with favorable winds pushing the Nina steadily eastward. Columbus maintained careful records of their progress, documenting wind patterns, ocean currents, and the behavior of seabirds. His meticulous observations would prove invaluable for future navigators attempting to cross the Atlantic. On January 6th, they encountered the Pinta sailing toward them from the southeast. The reunion was bittersweet, as Martin Alonso Pinzon claimed to have been searching for the main fleet, while obviously pursuing his own quest for gold. Columbus accepted Pinzon's explanation with diplomatic grace, but the incident highlighted the challenges of maintaining discipline during such unprecedented voyages. The combined fleet now faced the greatest test of the entire expedition. The Atlantic in winter was a treacherous opponent, with storms that could swamp small vessels and winds that could drive ships far off course. Columbus had crossed the ocean once, but the return journey would prove whether his navigation skills could withstand nature's full fury. February brought the anticipated storms. On February 12th, the two ships encountered a tempest that threatened to destroy everything Columbus had accomplished. Waves towered over the small vessels, and winds howled with a ferocity that terrified even experienced sailors. The Nina and Pinta were separated in the darkness, each crew believing the other had been lost. According to meteorological studies by the National Weather Service, the North Atlantic winter storms that Columbus encountered represent some of the most dangerous sailing conditions in the world, with wave heights regularly exceeding 40 feet. Columbus made a desperate decision during the storm's worst moments. Convinced that his ship might not survive, he wrote a brief account of his discoveries, sealed it in a barrel, and threw it overboard, hoping that someone would eventually find it and report his achievements to the Spanish crown. This act demonstrated both his dedication to his mission and his genuine fear that all might be lost. The storm gradually subsided, but the Nina found herself alone on the vast ocean. With no sign of the Pinta, Columbus faced the possibility that he might be the only survivor of the expedition's leadership, carrying the sole responsibility for reporting their discoveries to Europe. The weight of this burden, combined with the constant threat of storms, tested his endurance to its limits. On February 15th, the lookout spotted land to the northeast. As they approached, Columbus realized they had reached the Azores, Portuguese islands that represented the first European territory they had seen in over 6 months. The sight of familiar coastlines brought tears to the eyes of men who had begun to doubt they would ever see home again. The Portuguese reception was initially hostile, as the local officials suspected the Spanish of trespassing in Portuguese waters. Columbus was forced to negotiate carefully, emphasizing his peaceful intentions while concealing the full extent of his discoveries. The political tensions between Spain and Portugal added another layer of complexity to his already challenging situation. After obtaining supplies and making repairs, the Nina departed the Azores on February 23rd. The final leg of the journey to Spain should have been routine, but Columbus faced one last trial. Another storm struck off the coast of Portugal, forcing him to seek shelter in the Tagus River near Lisbon. The irony was not lost on Columbus that he would first report his discoveries to Portugal, the nation that had rejected his original proposal. King John II of Portugal received him with a mixture of curiosity and regret, realizing that his country had missed an opportunity that might have changed the balance of power in Europe. On March 4th, the Nina finally reached the Tagus, and Columbus sent word to the Spanish court announcing his successful return. The news traveled quickly through Lisbon, creating a sensation among Portuguese nobles who understood the implications of Columbus's achievements. The admiral had not only survived his impossible journey, but had returned with evidence of new lands across the ocean sea. The Pinta, meanwhile, had survived the storms and arrived at the Spanish port of Bayona on March 1st. Martin Alonso Pinzon, exhausted by the ordeal and possibly ill, died shortly after reaching Spain, taking with him his own version of the expedition's achievements and failures. Columbus prepared for his triumphant return to the Spanish court, but he could not have imagined the full impact his discoveries would have on European civilization. The age of exploration had entered a new phase, and the world would never be the same. The bells of Palos de la Frontera rang out across the harbor on March 15, 1493, as the Nina sailed into the very port from which Columbus had departed 7 months earlier. The man who had left Spain as an unknown Italian navigator with an impossible dream now returned as the admiral of the ocean sea, bearing proof that the western route to the Indies was not only possible, but profitable. Word of Columbus's return had preceded him, and crowds gathered at the waterfront to witness the historic homecoming. The exotic birds, strange plants, and most remarkably, the 6 Taino natives who had survived the journey, provided tangible evidence that Columbus had indeed reached unknown lands. Across the Atlantic, the admiral wasted no time in preparing for his audience with the Spanish monarchs. He organized a carefully choreographed presentation that would demonstrate the wealth and potential of his discoveries. The Taino were dressed in their finest ornaments. The gold samples were displayed prominently, and the exotic plants and animals were arranged to create maximum impact. Columbus's journey to the Spanish court in Barcelona became a triumphal procession. At every stop, crowds gathered to see the man who had accomplished the impossible and the exotic peoples he had brought back from the edge of the world. The political implications of his success were immediately apparent to European observers, who understood that Spain had gained a significant advantage in the race for global dominance. The formal audience with Ferdinand and Isabella took place in April 1493, in a ceremony that would be remembered as one of the most significant moments in European history. Columbus presented his discoveries with the skill of an experienced diplomat, carefully emphasizing the potential for wealth, the opportunities for Christian conversion, and the strategic advantages of Spanish control over the western ocean routes. The Spanish monarchs were both impressed and delighted by Columbus's achievements. The gold samples, though modest, proved that precious metals were available in the new lands. The cotton and spices suggested that the islands could produce valuable trade goods. Most importantly, the presence of the Taino demonstrated that there were souls to be saved for Christianity. Fulfilling one of the primary justifications for the expedition, Ferdinand and Isabella immediately authorized a second voyage, this time with a much larger fleet and more ambitious goals. Columbus would return to the Caribbean with 17 ships and over 1,200 men, including colonists, soldiers, and missionaries. The age of Spanish colonization in the Americas had begun in earnest. Historical analysis by the Library of Congress indicates that Columbus's first voyage report, published in multiple languages across Europe, became one of the most widely circulated documents of the 15th century, fundamentally altering European understanding of world geography. The publication of Columbus's account of his voyage created a sensation throughout Europe. Scholars, merchants, and rulers across the continent studied his descriptions of the new lands. Recognizing that the balance of global power had shifted dramatically, Portugal, England, and France began planning their own expeditions to claim portions of the newly discovered territories. The impact on European society was immediate and profound. The arrival of new crops from the Americas would eventually transform European agriculture and diet. The influx of precious metals would fuel economic expansion and inflation. The encounter with previously unknown peoples would challenge European assumptions about geography, race, and religion. For the Taino and other indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, Columbus's voyage marked the beginning of a catastrophic transformation. The diseases brought by the Europeans would devastate native populations, while the Spanish demand for gold and labor would destroy traditional ways of life. The collision of civilizations that began with Columbus's first voyage would have consequences that lasted for centuries. Columbus himself would make 3 more voyages to the Americas, but he would never fully understand the magnitude of what he had discovered. He died in 1506, still believing that he had found a western route to Asia rather than an entirely new continent. The lands he had reached would eventually be named America after Amerigo Vespucci, but Columbus's role as the catalyst for European expansion into the New World remained undisputed. The age of exploration that began with Columbus's first voyage would continue for centuries, as Europeans pushed deeper into the Americas, around Africa to Asia, and eventually across the Pacific Ocean. The small fleet that had departed Palos in August 1490 had initiated a process that would reshape every continent on Earth. As the sun set over Barcelona on that April day in 1493, Columbus stood before the Spanish court as a man transformed. The dreamer, who had begged for support 7 months earlier, was now the most famous explorer in Europe, the admiral of the ocean sea, and the man who had opened the door to a new world. The age of global exploration had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The epic journey of Christopher Columbus had ended, but the age of exploration it had launched was just beginning. The world had become a smaller place, and the consequences of that transformation would echo through the centuries to come.